I always say there are two kinds of people who knock on a cabin door at night: neighbors and people who think they own the place. The screen door rattled before I even stood up from the kitchen table, the sharp metallic clack echoing through the quiet like someone testing how far they could push their luck. Outside, gravel crunched under tires. A golf cart, maybe two. The kind HOA presidents love to drive around like they're patrolling the perimeter of Fort Knox instead of a lakeside subdivision. The smell of pine and lake water drifted through the cracked window behind me, cool September air sliding across the wooden floorboards of my cabin. It was supposed to be a quiet evening. Just me, a pot of black coffee, and a private conversation that absolutely nobody in Blackwood Lake Estates was supposed to know about. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and the little cedar cabin sitting 50 yards from the edge of Blackwood Lake has been in my family longer than most of the houses in this neighborhood have existed. My dad bought the land back in 1979 when the shoreline was still mostly wild, and the only traffic you heard at night was crickets and the occasional bass boat heading home late. Back then there was no HOA, no matching mailboxes, no committees arguing about what shade of beige a fence should be. Just lake water, tall pines, and a gravel road that turned to dust every summer. Things changed about 10 years ago when developers discovered the lake. Suddenly the woods started disappearing and rows of expensive homes popped up like mushrooms after a rainstorm. That's when the HOA showed up, along with the woman who ran it like her personal kingdom. Diane Whitmore, 53 years old, real estate agent, HOA president for 8 straight years, and the kind of person who carries a clipboard the way a sheriff carries a badge. Diane liked to remind people that she was responsible for protecting property values around the lake. What she really meant was that she liked deciding who belonged here and who didn't. My cabin sat just outside the official HOA boundary, which apparently bothered her more than anything else in the world. For the past 6 months, she'd been sending letters, notices, little official envelopes printed with the HOA logo. Complaints about my dock. Complaints about the color of my roof. Complaints about a canoe that, according to her, made the shoreline look unregulated. The funny thing was none of it actually applied to me. My land wasn't in her HOA. The boundary line sat about 40 feet past my driveway, a fact that made Diane Whitmore visibly uncomfortable every time she drove by in her white SUV. Tonight, though, the situation felt different. Because while Diane believed I was just another cabin owner ignoring her rules, the man sitting across the table from me knew exactly how much trouble that HOA was about to be in. He lifted his coffee mug slowly as the door handle outside rattled again, harder this time, followed by a woman's voice cutting through the night air. HOA inspection. Open this door immediately. I didn't move. Across the table, Robert Hayes, State Attorney General for the entire state, set his mug down quietly and raised one eyebrow as if he'd just been handed the most interesting piece of evidence in the investigation. The door handle rattled again, sharper this time, followed by the dull thump of someone knocking with the side of their fist like they were serving a warrant instead of standing on a wooden porch beside a lake. I could hear the faint electric whine of a golf cart motor idling outside, and the soft murmur of voices that did not belong anywhere near my property at 8 o'clock at night. Robert Hayes leaned back in his chair across the table, completely calm, the overhead cabin light reflecting off the polished wood surface between us. He had the kind of composure you only see in people who have spent decades walking into courtrooms full of hostile lawyers and walking out with signed rulings in their briefcase. He glanced toward the door and then back at me with a small, almost amused expression. I let out a slow breath and looked around the kitchen for a moment because this room held more history than most people in this subdivision realized. The oak cabinets had been installed by my father and my uncle one long summer in 1982 when I was 9 years old, and mostly useful for carrying tools and handing up nails. The lake sat just beyond the back windows, black glass under the moonlight, stretching nearly 2 miles from one end of Blackwood County to the other. On quiet nights, you could hear the water brushing against the dock posts like someone slowly turning pages in a book. For most of my life, this place had been exactly that kind of quiet. My father used to say the lake had a way of slowing the world down, like time itself respected the shoreline. When he passed away 4 years ago, the cabin came to me along with the 2 acres around it, including the narrow strip of land that ran straight down to the water. That strip of land was the reason the HOA had never been comfortable with me. See, the developers who built Blackwood Lake Estates had purchased almost every inch of shoreline on the north side of the lake except for one stubborn rectangle of property my father refused to sell. That rectangle was now mine, and it happened to sit directly between two sections of shoreline the HOA had quietly been trying to connect for years. They wanted continuous access along the lake. They wanted boat slips, walking paths, and private docks they could advertise in real estate listings. What they did not want was a family cabin sitting right in the middle of their plan like a nail sticking up through a floorboard. Diane Whitmore had been trying to solve that problem ever since she became HOA president. At first, she tried the polite approach. Friendly letters, community invitations, suggestions about how much easier life would be if I simply joined the association. When that did not work, the tone of the letters changed. Citations, notices, warnings about inspections and compliance reviews that technically meant nothing outside HOA property lines, but sounded intimidating enough to make most homeowners nervous. The knocking came again, louder now, and Diane Whitmore's voice followed right behind it. Mr. Caldwell, I know you are inside. This property is subject to HOA shoreline regulations, and we are conducting an inspection tonight. Robert Hayes slowly folded his hands on the table and looked toward the door like a man watching a chess piece move exactly where he expected it to. That, he said quietly, sounds like the president of Blackwood Lake Estates. I nodded once and stood up from the chair, the wooden floor creaking under my boots as I walked toward the door. Outside, the porch light cast a pale circle across the gravel driveway where two golf carts waited and three figures stood clustered near the steps like they were about to enforce rules that had never applied to my land in the first place. The porch light flicked on above my head with a dry electrical click, and the three figures outside shifted slightly in the sudden glow, like actors stepping into a stage spotlight they had not expected yet. Diane Whitmore stood at the front of the steps with her arms folded tightly across a white blazer that probably cost more than the outboard motor tied to my dock. Even from 10 feet away, I could see the familiar expression she always wore during HOA meetings, the one that mixed patience with the quiet confidence of someone convinced the rules always belonged to her. Behind her stood two men in dark polo shirts with small embroidered HOA badges, clipboard types who looked uncomfortable enough to suggest they would rather be anywhere else on a Thursday night. One of the golf carts hummed softly behind them, its headlights throwing long yellow beams across the gravel driveway and the old pine trees lining the edge of the property. Diane tilted her chin slightly upward when she saw me step into the doorway. There you are, Mr. Caldwell, she said, her voice carrying that crisp suburban authority that sounded rehearsed. I was beginning to think you were avoiding us. The smell of lake water drifted across the porch, cool and mineral sharp, mixing with the faint scent of motor oil from the carts. I leaned one shoulder against the doorframe and looked past her toward the shoreline where the dock lights reflected in narrow ripples across the water. The lake looked calm enough to swallow all the noise standing on my porch. It is Thursday night, I said calmly. Most people around here knock during daylight hours. Diane ignored the comment completely and lifted a thin folder from under her arm like a teacher about to hand out detention slips. We are here conducting a shoreline compliance inspection, she said. Your property has been flagged multiple times for violations involving dock placement, boundary fencing, and unauthorized lake access structures. The two men behind her shifted their weight slightly, but remained silent, the way assistants usually do when someone else is determined to run the conversation. Diane opened the folder and glanced down as if reading a script she had already memorized. As president of Blackwood Lake Estates Homeowners Association, I have the authority to inspect any structure impacting shared shoreline access. I almost smiled at that line because I had heard a version of it 3 times already that summer. The difference tonight was that she sounded far more confident than usual, like she believed something had finally tilted in her favor. Maybe she assumed I would be alone. Maybe she thought the late hour would make me nervous enough to let them walk inside and photograph everything from the dock ladder to the back porch steps. Diane took one step closer to the porch, and the wooden boards creaked softly under her heel. If you refuse to cooperate, she continued, the association will have no choice but to proceed with enforcement measures through the county. The lake wind brushed through the pine branches above us, carrying the distant splash of a fish somewhere out in the darkness. I could hear a chair scrape faintly across the kitchen floor behind me inside the cabin. Diane did not notice it. She was too focused on the performance she had prepared for this moment. Her eyes moved briefly past my shoulder toward the open doorway, but only long enough to confirm the lights were on inside. "So here is what is going to happen," she said firmly. "You are going to step aside and allow us to conduct our inspection tonight." For a moment, the porch fell completely quiet except for the soft electric buzz of the golf cart headlights and the slow rhythm of water touching the dock posts down by the lake. I stood in the doorway for a moment and let the silence stretch just long enough to make Diane Whitmore slightly uncomfortable. The porch boards creaked softly under the shifting weight of the two HOA assistants behind her, and the cool wind coming off the lake pushed a slow wave of pine scent through the open cabin door. Diane held her folder like it was some kind of official badge, the kind people wave around when they want authority to appear larger than it really is. I had seen that posture before. It usually showed up right before someone realized they had stepped on a ground they did not actually control. I looked down at the folder in her hands and then back up at her face. "Diane," I said, calmly, "we have had this conversation before." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Apparently not enough times," she replied. "Because your dock is still outside compliance and your shoreline fence is obstructing shared access." The phrase shared access hung in the air like a bad punchline. That was the language the HOA had been pushing for months now. Shared shoreline, community access, recreational easements. It sounded harmless enough if you did not know the history of this lake. The truth was that my father's land had never been part of their development plan. When the developers bought the northern shoreline 12 years ago, they assumed eventually every remaining property owner would sell. Most of them did. One by one, the small fishing cabins disappeared, and the lots turned into $300,000 homes with stone patios and matching docks. But my father had never sold. He used to stand on this very porch with a cup of coffee and watch the survey flags pop up around the lake like bright little warnings. "They will try to connect the shoreline someday," he told me once, pointing toward the cove just east of the dock. "But they cannot do it without this land." I did not fully understand what he meant back then. I was too busy thinking about fishing lines and summer storms rolling across the water. Now I understood exactly what he had meant. My cabin sat right between two sections of HOA property that they had been quietly trying to merge into one long stretch of controlled shoreline. Diane Whitmore had been chasing that goal for years. Tonight she clearly believed she had found a way to force the issue. She took another small step forward on the porch and raised her voice slightly, the way people do when they think volume might create legitimacy. "The association has received multiple complaints about restricted access along this section of the lake," she said. "Your fencing and dock placement are interfering with the shoreline corridor that connects the eastern and western community areas." I could hear the faint clink of ceramic behind me as Robert Hayes set his coffee mug down inside the kitchen. Diane still did not notice. She was too focused on the speech she had prepared. I leaned one hand against the doorframe and looked past her toward the water again. The moon had climbed higher over the trees, now throwing a pale silver reflection across the lake that stretched almost to the edge of the dock. It was the same view my father had watched for decades. "Diane," I said slowly, "there is no shoreline corridor here." She opened her mouth to respond, but I continued before she could speak. "There is a private property line that has been on record since 1979. The two assistants behind her exchanged a quick glance, the kind that passes between people who suddenly realize they might be standing in the middle of a disagreement that is about to get complicated. Diane, however, did not step back. If anything, she seemed more determined. She lifted the folder again and tapped the top page with one finger. "The HOA board voted last month to authorize inspections of any property impacting the shoreline pathway," she said firmly. "And tonight we are exercising that authority." Behind me, the chair inside the kitchen moved again, slow and deliberate, and the sound carried clearly through the open doorway. The chair inside the kitchen scraped softly across the wooden floor again, slow and deliberate, the kind of sound that carries farther in a quiet cabin than people expect. Diane Whitmore paused mid-sentence for half a second, her eyes flicking toward the doorway like she had finally realized this conversation might involve more than just me standing on the porch. The lake wind pushed gently through the open door behind my shoulder, stirring the faint smell of coffee and cedar inside the room. I stayed exactly where I was, one hand resting against the doorframe, watching the way her expression shifted from certainty to mild curiosity. "You hear that?" I asked casually. Diane straightened slightly and forced a thin smile that looked more practiced than confident. "What I hear," she said, tapping the folder in her hand again, "is a homeowner refusing to cooperate with a lawful inspection." The two men behind her remained quiet, but their posture had changed. They were no longer leaning forward like people expecting to walk inside and take pictures of a dock violation. Now they looked more like employees waiting to see how a situation might unfold before deciding whether they should still be part of it. The lake behind them rolled in slow black ripples under the moonlight, and the dock lights reflected in narrow golden lines across the water. It was the same quiet shoreline my father used to watch from this porch long before golf carts and HOA badges ever appeared on this road. Diane lifted her chin again, trying to recover the authority she had walked up here with. "This is the final time I am going to ask," she said firmly. "Step aside and allow the association to complete the inspection tonight." I took a slow breath and glanced over my shoulder toward the kitchen. Robert Hayes had pushed his chair back and was standing near the edge of the table now, tall and relaxed, his jacket draped neatly over the back of the chair where he had been sitting. He had not raised his voice once since Diane arrived. In fact, he had barely moved at all. But there was something about the way he observed the scene that reminded me of a courtroom spectator who already knew exactly how the case would end. Diane still could not see him clearly from the porch because the kitchen light was behind her and the doorway framed only a narrow slice of the room. All she could see was movement. "Diane," I said quietly, turning back toward her, "before you go any further tonight, you should probably understand something about this cabin." She rolled her eyes slightly, the way someone does when they think they are about to hear another excuse. "I am not interested in stories about fishing cabins or family history," she said. "This is about shoreline regulation." The two assistants shifted again behind her, and one of them cleared his throat like he was reconsidering whether this inspection was still a good idea. I nodded slowly and looked back into the cabin for a moment. Robert Hayes stepped forward just enough that the kitchen light caught the edge of his face and the dark suit he wore. Diane's voice trailed off mid-breath as her eyes moved past me and into the doorway. The folder in her hands lowered about 2 inches without her realizing it. The lake wind rustled the pine branches above the porch, and for the first time since she arrived, the confidence in Diane Whitmore's posture began to crack just a little. For a moment, nobody on the porch said a word. The lake breeze moved quietly through the pine branches above us, and the faint sound of water touching the dock carried up the slope behind the cabin. Diane Whitmore was still staring past my shoulder into the doorway like her brain was trying to decide whether what she was seeing actually belonged there. Robert Hayes stepped forward another half step into the light from the kitchen, calm and unhurried, the way someone does when they have spent most of their career letting other people finish talking before saying anything important. The overhead cabin light caught the edge of his suit jacket and the silver watch on his wrist. He did not look surprised to find 3 people standing on the porch demanding authority they did not actually have. In fact, he looked mildly curious, like a man who had just discovered a detail in a case file that confirmed a theory he had been considering for months. Diane's voice came out slower now, a little less certain than it had been 30 seconds earlier. "And who exactly is this?" she asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. Robert Hayes stopped just inside the doorway and folded his hands loosely in front of him. "Good evening," he said in a calm voice that carried easily across the porch without ever sounding loud. "I hope we are not interrupting anything important." The 2 HOA assistants immediately shifted their stance. One of them glanced at the other with an expression that clearly said they had just realized this inspection might not be as simple as they had expected. Diane straightened her shoulders again, forcing confidence back into her posture. "This is an HOA compliance inspection," she said quickly, as if the words themselves could restore control. "And the association has every right to evaluate structures that interfere with community shoreline access." Robert Hayes listened without interrupting. He simply nodded once and looked out toward the lake for a moment, the moonlight reflecting faintly off the water behind Diane's shoulder. "Shoreline access," he repeated quietly, as though testing the phrase. Then he turned his attention back to Diane with a polite expression that somehow made the porch feel smaller. "That is an interesting subject," he said, "because that is exactly what Mr. Caldwell and I have been discussing this evening." Diane blinked once. The folder in her hands lowered another inch. "Discussing with you?" she asked. Robert Hayes gave a small nod. "Yes, ma'am." He stepped fully into the doorway now so the porch light illuminated his face clearly. There was a short pause where the night seemed to hold its breath. The two assistants looked from him to Diane and back again like spectators at a tennis match that had suddenly changed direction. Robert Hayes spoke again in the same calm tone. "Allow me to introduce myself properly," he said. "My name is Robert Hayes." Diane waited, expecting the rest of the sentence to explain why a stranger was standing in this cabin during her inspection. Robert Hayes did not rush the moment. He simply held her gaze for another quiet second before continuing. "I serve as the state attorney general." The words landed softly, but the effect on the porch was immediate. One of the assistants exhaled slowly. Diane's posture stiffened in a way that suggested several pieces of information had just collided inside her head at the same time. The lake wind moved across the porch again, and the folder in her hands shifted slightly as her grip tightened around the edge. The words seemed to hang in the air above the porch like a stone dropped into still water. "State Attorney General." Nobody moved for a moment. The faint electric hum of the golf cart headlights suddenly sounded louder than it had a minute ago, and the lake wind brushed across the wooden railing beside the steps. Diane Whitmore stared at Robert Hayes as if she had just discovered the script she had been reading from no longer applied to the scene in front of her. The two assistants behind her reacted first. One of them straightened his posture and quietly lowered the clipboard he had been holding, the way people do when they realize the authority they thought they represented might actually belong to someone else. Diane blinked once and forced a tight smile that looked like it required more effort than confidence. "Attorney General," she said slowly, as if repeating the words might change what they meant. "Well, that is unexpected." Robert Hayes did not respond with surprise or irritation. He simply nodded politely, the same calm expression still resting on his face. "It often is," he replied, "particularly when discussions about shoreline access and property rights are involved." Diane shifted her weight slightly on the porch, her heels clicking softly against the wood. The folder in her hands was still open, but she was no longer reading from it. Instead, her eyes moved briefly toward the lake behind us, and then back to Hayes as if she was trying to measure how serious this situation had suddenly become. "This is a private HOA matter," she said carefully. "We are simply enforcing our community regulations." Hayes glanced toward the dark shoreline stretching behind the golf carts, and then back toward Diane with a thoughtful expression. "Community regulations are certainly important," he said calmly. "But they become complicated when those regulations extend beyond the legal boundary of the association." Diane's jaw tightened just slightly. She clearly had not expected the conversation to turn into a legal discussion on the porch. "Our shoreline pathway plan has already been approved by the board," she replied quickly. "The corridor connects two sections of lakefront property owned by the association." Hayes nodded again, almost approvingly, like a professor listening to a student explain a theory. "Yes," he said. "That corridor plan is one of the documents we reviewed earlier this evening." Diane's eyebrows lifted before she could stop the reaction. "Reviewed?" she asked. Hayes gestured lightly toward the kitchen table behind him, where several papers still lay beside 2 coffee mugs and a small stack of county records. "Mr. Caldwell was kind enough to show me the survey history for this shoreline," he said, "including the 1979 deed that establishes the boundary of this property." The lake wind rustled the pine branches overhead, and the assistants exchanged another uneasy glance. Diane looked past Hayes into the cabin now, noticing the papers on the table for the first time. The folder in her hands shifted again as her fingers tightened around the edge. Hayes continued speaking in the same measured tone. "As it turns out," he said, "the land between those two sections of HOA shoreline is not part of the association at all." Diane said nothing. Hayes gave a small nod toward the gravel driveway and the dark stretch of lake beyond it. "Which means the pathway your board approved would cross private property." The quiet on the porch grew heavier. Hayes finished the thought without raising his voice. "And that," he said gently, "is precisely why I am here tonight." The porch went quiet in a way that only happens when someone realizes the conversation has moved into territory they did not plan for. Diane Whitmore stood perfectly still. At the bottom of the steps, the folder in her hands no longer moving, her eyes drifting past Robert Hayes toward the kitchen table where the county maps and survey documents were spread out under the warm cabin light. The lake breeze moved gently through the open doorway behind me, carrying the faint smell of cedar and coffee across the porch. Hayes did not raise his voice or change his posture. He simply rested one hand lightly against the doorframe and looked at Diane the way a patient teacher watches a student slowly connect pieces of information they should have noticed earlier. Earlier this week, he continued calmly, our office received several documents related to shoreline access proposals submitted by the Blackwood Lake Estates Homeowners Association. Diane's expression tightened. The two assistants behind her shifted their weight again, and one of them glanced down toward the gravel like he suddenly wished he had chosen a different place to spend his evening. Hayes nodded slightly toward the papers inside the cabin. Those proposals include a mapped pathway connecting the east and west sections of the HOA shoreline, he said. A pathway that, according to the documents, passes directly through this property. The lake water brushed softly against the dock posts below the hill, the quiet sound rising through the trees like slow breathing. Diane finally spoke again, but the sharp authority she had arrived with was gone. The association was advised that the corridor could be negotiated, she said carefully. Hayes tilted his head slightly. Negotiated, he repeated. Yes, I saw that language in the proposal. He paused for a moment, letting the words sit in the air. What concerned my office, he continued, was the section that described enforcement actions if the property owner refused. Diane's fingers tightened around the edge of her folder. Hayes did not accuse or threaten. He simply spoke in the same measured tone he had used all evening. Specifically the plan to declare the shoreline an obstruction to community access and authorize inspections without consent. One of the assistants quietly lowered his clipboard all the way to his side. Diane's eyes moved briefly toward him and then back to Hayes. The porch light reflected faintly off the lake behind her, and the night air seemed cooler now than it had when she arrived. Hayes gestured once more toward the cabin table. Mr. Caldwell showed me the original property survey filed with the county in 1979, he said. The same document that confirms the lakefront boundary of this land has not changed for over 4 decades. Diane said nothing. Hayes continued gently, which means the proposed corridor would require the association to obtain legal access through private land. The wind rustled the pine needles above us, and somewhere out on the water a fish broke the surface with a soft splash. Hayes looked from Diane to the two assistants and back again before finishing the thought. Instead, he said, your board appears to have moved forward under the assumption that the property could simply be treated as part of the shoreline network. Diane opened her mouth as if she wanted to correct him, but the words did not come. Hayes gave a small nod, the kind people give when they know a difficult explanation has just become unavoidable. That assumption, he said quietly, is exactly what my office is reviewing right now. For several seconds nobody spoke. The quiet around the cabin felt different now, heavier, like the night itself had slowed down to listen. Diane Whitmore stood at the bottom of the steps with the same folder she had marched up here with, but the authority she carried when she arrived had faded into something far less certain. The two assistants behind her were no longer standing like inspectors waiting for permission to enter a property. They looked more like people hoping the conversation would end before their names appeared in any official report. Robert Hayes remained in the doorway beside me, calm and steady, his hands resting loosely at his sides. He had not raised his voice once since Diane appeared. He did not need to. The lake breeze drifted up the hill again, carrying the quiet sound of water brushing against the dock posts below the trees. Diane finally cleared her throat and tried to regain control of the moment. If there has been a misunderstanding about the corridor plan, she said carefully, the association can certainly review the proposal again. Hayes nodded once, not disagreeing. Review would be a wise first step, he replied, because any attempt to extend HOA authority beyond its legal boundary creates a serious problem. Diane shifted slightly on the gravel. The folder in her hands lowered until it rested against her leg. Hayes continued in the same calm tone that had guided the entire conversation. Property law is very clear on this matter, he said. Private land does not become community access simply because a board vote declares it convenient. One of the assistants quietly stepped back half a pace, the gravel crunching softly under his shoe. Diane glanced toward him for a split second and then looked back at Hayes. The porch light reflected faintly in her eyes, and for the first time since she arrived the confidence that had carried her up the steps was completely gone. Hayes gestured lightly toward the lake behind her. Blackwood Lake is a beautiful place, he said. But the rules that govern land around it still come from the county records office, not the HOA newsletter. The wind rustled the tall pines above us, and the moonlight stretched across the water like a silver road leading out into the dark. Diane said nothing for a long moment. Then she slowly closed the folder she had been holding all evening. The sound of the papers sliding together was the loudest thing on the porch. She nodded once, short and tight, and stepped backward toward the golf carts. Neither assistant spoke as they turned with her and moved quietly across the gravel driveway. The electric motor of the cart hummed softly as it rolled toward the road, and the headlights faded between the trees. The lake returned to its usual silence. I stood there for another minute watching the empty driveway before glancing back at Hayes. He looked out toward the shoreline where the dock lights reflected across the calm water. "Your father chose that property well," he said. I nodded and listened to the gentle sound of the lake moving under the moonlight. Some people believe power comes from raising your voice or carrying the biggest rulebook on the block. But nights like this prove something far simpler. Real authority does not shout across a porch in the dark. Real authority shows up quietly, reads the paperwork, and lets the truth stand exactly where it has always been.